What if the future of your entire legacy hinged on a secret so dark, it erased a dynasty? The Valois faced this nightmare, a historical enigma that makes true crime look tame. Welcome to my channel Words of Time, and uncover the chilling truth behind history's most compelling unsolved mystery, where vanished heirs are just the beginning of a truly shocking story. The story of the Valois dynasty begins not in peace or prosperity, but in a cauldron of ambition and rivalry that shaped France for centuries. They were more than a royal family. They were a force that carved the nation's identity through war, marriage, betrayal, and faith. From the 13th century onward, their rule defined what it meant to be French, yet the glow of their crowns hid shadows that few dared to confront. Behind the grandeur of their palaces and the solemn beauty of their cathedrals lay a strange truth. The Valois line was touched by a mystery that seemed to stalk its heirs, generation after generation. Princes and princesses disappeared, vanished into legend, leaving behind confusion, fear, and silence. The tale of the Valois is not only about thrones and treaties. It is a story of people consumed by the fire of destiny. The name itself carries weight, echoing through history as both a triumph and a warning. From the coronation of Philip of Valois to the decline of Henry III, their reign stretched across some of the most turbulent years in Europe. They faced endless wars, most notably with England during the long and devastating conflict known as the 100 Years' War. They ruled over a France that was both glorious and fragile, a kingdom constantly at risk of falling apart. But beneath the familiar stories of battles and alliances lies something more troubling. Records from the time mention strange absences, heirs who simply vanished from the stage of history without clear explanation. Chroniclers wrote of young nobles who died too soon, of daughters sent to convents who were never seen again, and of sons whose fates were recorded only in rumors. Among these were Jean of Valois and Marie of Valois, names that once held promise for the dynasty's future, but are now little more than footnotes. They did not die in battle or from known illness. They simply disappeared, leaving the royal line weaker, and the court whispering about what might have happened to them. For centuries, historians have tried to make sense of these disappearances. Some claim it was disease, others suspect secret assassinations, and a few suggest the victims were hidden away for political reasons. Yet none of these theories fully explain the pattern that seems to follow the Valois through their generations. Every time the dynasty appeared secure, every time a future seemed certain, something tore that security apart. The heirs who were supposed to carry the name forward often met mysterious ends. It was as though the Valois were cursed to watch their future crumble from within. To understand this dynasty's secret, one must look at the world in which they ruled. The Valois rose to power during a period when France was a land divided by ambition. Noble families vied for control, and loyalty often shifted with the wind. The church's power loomed over the crown, and superstition guided many decisions at court. It was an age when astrology influenced politics, when prophecy and rumor could destroy a reputation, and when royal blood carried both privilege and peril. In such a world, the disappearance of an heir was not just a family tragedy, it was a threat to the entire realm. Jean of Valois was one of the first to vanish under strange circumstances. He was young, clever, and reportedly favored by his father. Chroniclers describe him as a child with a curious mind, more interested in books than weapons. Yet before he reached maturity, he was gone. Some claimed he fell ill during a journey. Others insisted he was sent away for education and never returned. A few darker accounts whispered that he was taken by forces beyond human control. The truth was buried with the silence of the royal court, which refused to discuss his fate. His name faded from official documents, and his death was never properly recorded. Then there was Marie of Valois, a princess of unusual grace and intelligence. She was known for her charm and her diplomatic promise, often present at gatherings meant to unite rival houses through marriage. Her sudden disappearance caused a storm of speculation. Some said she ran away with a lover, others that she was poisoned. Yet there were no public accusations, no funeral, no evidence. Only absence. Her chambers were cleared, her portraits removed, and her name rarely spoken afterward. To the people, it was as if she had never existed. The court moved on, as courts always do, but these absences left cracks in the royal foundation. The loss of heirs meant instability, and instability bred suspicion. Ministers and nobles began to turn against one another, each fearing they might be next to fall victim to whatever force seemed to stalk the royal line. Some believed the disappearances were part of a political scheme. Rival houses, perhaps even branches of the Valois themselves, may have plotted to control the line of succession. Others whispered of a darker influence, a curse that dated back to the founding of the dynasty, when blood was spilled to claim the crown. The Valois had risen to power through conflict. Their founder, Philip of Valois, claimed the throne after the death of the last direct Capetian king. His right to rule was contested by the English monarch, who also claimed descent from the French royal house. This dispute ignited the 100 Years' War, a struggle that defined generations. From that moment, the Valois carried not only a crown but also a burden of legitimacy. They ruled as kings always do, through strength and fear, but they never escaped the shadow of doubt that hung over their claim. Some believed that this doubt itself was the beginning of their curse. Each generation seemed to repeat the same story: a promising heir lost, a line of succession broken, a dynasty shaken. It was as if fate demanded that no peace could last for the Valois. Even in moments of triumph, the pattern continued. After victories in battle or successful treaties, tragedy often followed. The most celebrated kings, such as Charles V, who brought a measure of order to France, could not protect their bloodline from decay. His descendants faced rebellion, madness, and sudden death. The royal line flickered like a candle. The people of France, deeply religious and superstitious, saw in these events the hand of divine justice. Some claimed that the Valois had angered heaven through pride and sin. Others believed they were being punished for the betrayal and bloodshed that had secured their throne in the first place. Stories spread that the spirits of those wronged by the dynasty haunted the royal halls. Monks wrote of visions and omens. Comets, storms, and eclipses were all taken as signs that something unnatural surrounded the Valois crown. Yet superstition alone cannot explain the eerie precision with which heirs continued to vanish. Each disappearance seemed timed to strike at the heart of stability. When a king's rule was challenged, when alliances wavered, or when succession was in doubt, another heir would be lost. The pattern suggests purpose. Could it be that the Valois were victims of a secret design, a plot that reached beyond any one reign? If so, who would benefit? One theory among later scholars proposes that the disappearances were not random, but orchestrated by factions within the court. The French monarchy was never a monolith. It was a battleground of interests. Powerful nobles, clerics, and foreign agents all sought influence. Removing an heir could change the future of the realm. If Jean of Valois or Marie of Valois had lived, they might have shifted alliances, married rivals, or even ended wars. Their absence, therefore, served someone's purpose. But this explanation, while practical, leaves untouched the sense of dread that surrounded their fates. The Valois themselves seemed to believe something more than politics was at work. Private letters from the time hint at growing paranoia within the royal family. Some members refused to sleep in their chambers, claiming to hear voices or see shadows at night. Others turned to mystics and alchemists for protection. The court's fascination with the occult deepened during these years. Astrologers were consulted for every major decision, from marriages to campaigns. Even the most educated courtiers began to speak of omens and unseen forces. The line between faith and fear blurred, and within that confusion, the disappearances continued. The mystery deepened as France entered the later Valois period, marked by civil strife and religious war. The 16th century saw the kingdom torn apart by conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and the Valois kings struggled to maintain control. Amid this chaos, the dynasty's bloodline thinned. Brothers fought brothers, mothers plotted against sons, and each generation saw fewer legitimate heirs. It was as though the curse that began with Jean and Marie had consumed the entire house. By the time Henry III sat on the throne, the Valois name was nearly spent. He was the last of his line, a man haunted by the deaths that surrounded him. He faced rebellion from powerful nobles and betrayal from his own allies. In his final years, he became almost obsessed with religion, convinced that his suffering was punishment. When he was assassinated, the dynasty ended. The crown passed to the Bourbons, marking the close of an era that had begun in triumph and ended in blood. But even after the fall of the Valois, whispers persisted. Some claimed that not all the heirs were dead, that a few had survived in secret, hidden by loyalists or secret societies. Legends arose of lost princes and princesses living in disguise, their true lineage unknown to those around them. Others believed that the disappearances had never been about murder or exile, but about something far stranger. A pact made long ago, a trade between power and legacy that demanded the sacrifice of the innocent. The evidence for such a theory is, of course, elusive, yet the pattern remains hard to ignore. Across the centuries, every major moment of Valois power is matched by tragedy. The dynasty grew stronger only to collapse from within. Its kings built cathedrals, commissioned art, and led armies, but could not escape the silence that claimed their heirs. Their story is one of brilliance shadowed by loss, of human ambition haunted by forces beyond understanding. Perhaps the truth lies not in curses or conspiracies, but in the nature of power itself. Monarchies are built on fragile foundations, bloodlines, loyalty, and fear. To maintain them requires control so absolute that even family becomes a threat. In such an environment, disappearance can serve as a tool, a way to eliminate uncertainty without scandal. The Valois may have fallen victim not to the supernatural, but to their own system, a cycle of secrecy and sacrifice designed to preserve authority at any cost. Still, there is something unsettling about how the pattern persisted. Even if one accepts that politics drove the disappearances, why did they always strike the heirs? Why not ministers or rivals? Why always those destined to inherit? The question lingers like a wound that refuses to heal. It suggests that something more than logic governed the fate of the Valois. Whether that force was divine punishment, human ambition, or pure chance, it shaped the destiny of a nation. The legacy of the Valois endures in the stones of their castles, in the art they inspired, and in the myths they left behind. Yet beneath the splendor lies a darker inheritance. The memory of children who never grew old, of names erased from history, of futures that never came to pass. Their absence is as much a part of France's past as their presence. The royal crucible that forged the Valois also consumed them, turning their story into a lesson about the cost of power. The mystery of their vanished heirs remains unsolved, not because the evidence is lost, but because the truth may be too complex to fit within reason. Every account, every theory, carries traces of both fact and fear. Perhaps that is why their story still holds us. It reminds us that power, once gained, demands a price. For the Valois, that price may have been their future. And so, the Valois dynasty stands as both a monument and a warning. Their empire was magnificent, their influence vast, yet their lineage ended in whispers. The disappearances of Jean of Valois, Marie of Valois, and others like them were not just tragedies. They were symbols of something deeper, a curse born from ambition, secrecy, and the hunger for control. Whether the truth lies in politics, fate, or something darker still, one thing is certain. Within the golden halls of the Valois, power was never merely inherited. It was taken, guarded, and ultimately lost. Their tale endures not only in history books, but in the imagination, where it continues to ask an unsettling question. What if these vanishings were never accidents at all? What if the very pursuit of power, the same force that built their empire, also demanded a hidden sacrifice? The Valois built a dynasty that shaped a nation, but in doing so, they may have written their own doom. The royal crucible forged kings and queens, but it also consumed their heirs, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance touched by darkness, and a question that history has never answered. The silence that followed the vanished heirs of Jean and Marie of Valois did not fade with time. Instead, it deepened into a shadow that lingered over the dynasty. The court, still uneasy from earlier losses, began to look at each newborn prince or princess with both hope and fear. The promise of succession had become a fragile illusion, and every cradle in the royal nursery carried the weight of the kingdom's uncertain future. What had begun as whispers of misfortune now hardened into an unspoken dread. It was within this atmosphere that the next series of disappearances took place, claiming the lives and legacies of Louis of Valois and Philippe of Valois. Two children whose presence should have strengthened the royal bloodline, but whose sudden absence only worsened the sense that something was deeply wrong within the family. Louis of Valois was born into expectation. He was a boy of bright spirit, said to possess the same poise and calm that marked his father's rule. Chroniclers described him as gentle, curious, and unusually serious for his age. He was meant to carry forward the Valois legacy, a child groomed to heal the wounds left by the 100 Years' War and to restore stability to the royal line. Yet even as the bells of Paris rang to celebrate his birth, the air at court carried unease. The royal physicians were ever present around the young prince, recording each cough, each sign of weakness, as if they already feared the inevitable. When Louis was scarcely beyond childhood, reports surfaced of his sudden illness. The details are vague and conflicting. Some say he developed a fever after a hunting expedition. Others insist he was poisoned during a banquet, that his food had been tampered with by a servant bribed by a rival house. The official record is strangely brief, stating only that the prince fell ill and did not recover. The vague phrasing offers no clue, no comfort, and no proof. In the weeks following his death, rumors began to circulate that his body had not been buried in the royal crypt but hidden elsewhere. A few even claimed to have seen him alive, spirited away under cover of night. No confirmation ever came. His name was spoken less and less, and soon he became another ghost in the Valois line. Philippe of Valois, another young heir of promise, followed a similar fate. His story begins with an air of optimism. Described as lively and intelligent, he was said to have charmed both courtiers and commoners. Unlike his cousin Louis, Philippe showed a taste for adventure, spending long hours with his tutors studying maps, learning about distant lands, and imagining the expansion of French influence beyond Europe. He was, in every sense, a prince of vision, a symbol of what the Valois dynasty could become if fortune ever favored it. But fortune did not. One winter morning, Philippe disappeared from his chambers. At first, the court assumed he had gone riding, a habit he often indulged in. But when his horse was found still stabled, unease turned to alarm. Servants were questioned, guards were punished, and the palace searched from cellar to tower. Days passed without any sign of him. The official explanation was that he had drowned in the Seine during an outing, yet no witnesses ever confirmed seeing him near the river, and no body was recovered. His parents mourned him in silence, though some at court noticed that the queen's grief seemed haunted by something unspoken, as if she knew more than she dared admit. It was around this time that the first real panic took hold among the nobles. 2 heirs gone within a short span, both young, both full of potential, was too much to dismiss as coincidence. Court physicians, eager to shield their own reputations, blamed disease, citing mysterious fevers and ailments that could strike without warning. Yet the people were not convinced. Rumors of foul play spread through the taverns and marketplaces. Some spoke of secret enemies within the palace, others of divine punishment. And then there were those who whispered of darker forces, a shadow that fed upon the royal blood itself, demanding the lives of heirs in exchange for the crown's continued power. The church took interest in these events, as it always did when fear infected the populace. Priests preached caution against superstition, but offered no clear answers. A few more daring voices suggested that the dynasty had angered God by its wars, its greed, and its moral decay. Yet others within the clergy, more cautious and politic, avoided direct blame and instead advised prayer and repentance. The royal family, already wary of appearing weak, ordered that no more public mourning be held for missing heirs. Their grief became private, hidden behind heavy curtains and closed doors. What makes the disappearances of Louis and Philippe especially troubling is not merely that they were lost, but that the record of their lives seems deliberately erased. Birth records were altered, portraits removed, and official accounts shortened. It is as though the court sought to pretend they had never existed. Such erasure suggests an intent to control the narrative, to bury not only the dead, but also the memory of what had happened. For a dynasty obsessed with legitimacy, to remove heirs from history was an extraordinary act, one that hints at fear more than shame. Modern historians who have examined these cases struggle to agree on what truly occurred. The simplest explanation is that both young men died of illness, as their contemporaries claimed. Yet the absence of medical detail or burial evidence weakens that argument. Others point to the brutal nature of court politics at the time. The Valois were not universally loved. Their reign was marked by conflict, debt, and internal division. Rival noble houses, such as the Burgundians, had every reason to weaken them. A poisoned meal, a staged disappearance, such tactics were not uncommon. But even these political theories do not account for the peculiar pattern that continued for decades. Some scholars have ventured into more psychological interpretations. They argue that the disappearances may not have been literal deaths, but deliberate removals from the line of succession. In an age when legitimacy was everything, even a hint of scandal, birth out of wedlock, secret deformity, or questionable paternity, could ruin a dynasty. If either Louis or Philippe were suspected of such flaws, the court might have quietly sent them away, their deaths staged to preserve appearances. This theory, while plausible, fails to explain why the practice would continue through so many generations, affecting heirs who had no such rumors attached to them. As the fear surrounding these early losses grew, the palace became a place of suspicion. Servants no longer trusted one another. Guards doubled their patrols, but still the sense of unseen danger persisted. Mothers within the royal family became fiercely protective, refusing to let their children out of sight. Some hired personal guards. Others turned to spiritual protection, commissioning masses, relics, and amulets in hopes of warding off whatever evil seemed to haunt the bloodline. Chroniclers of the time describe strange scenes. A queen visiting a monastery in secret, leaving offerings at the tomb of a long-dead saint. A court astrologer found murdered after warning of a shadow among the stars. A royal physician dismissed after claiming that no earthly disease could explain the deaths. The line between superstition and reality blurred so completely that even those closest to the throne began to question their own reason. In this climate of fear, every illness, every misstep, every absence became a potential omen. When another child of the house, Charles of Valois, disappeared a few years later, the court's fragile calm shattered completely. Charles was no ordinary prince. He was older than the previous victims and already held responsibilities within the realm. He was trained in governance, respected by his peers, and seen as the likely successor to his father. His disappearance struck not just the royal family, but the entire political order of France. Charles's last days are recounted in several conflicting sources. One chronicler claims he rode out at dawn to inspect lands near the royal estate and never returned. Another insists he was seen that evening dining with nobles in a nearby town. A third source, written decades later, suggests that he was abducted by agents of a rival faction. Whatever the truth, he vanished without trace, and once again, no body was ever found. The pattern was no longer possible to ignore. In less than half a century, multiple heirs of the Valois bloodline had disappeared under inexplicable circumstances. The royal council met in secret to discuss the matter, though what they decided remains unknown. Rumor has it that a decree was passed forbidding the public discussion of royal deaths, unless confirmed by the king himself. From that moment on, every event surrounding the royal children was handled with extreme secrecy. The court had entered a new age, one defined by silence, control, and fear of its own lineage. Outside the palace, the people speculated freely. Some believed that the Valois were cursed by the spirit of a wronged ancestor. Others claimed the family had once made a pact to secure their power, and that the lost heirs were payment for that bargain. A few bolder voices accused the monarchy itself of sacrificing its own children to preserve its rule. Such tales may sound absurd now, but at the time they reflected the deep mistrust between the rulers and the ruled. When power seems unnatural, people search for unnatural explanations. As the decades passed, the disappearances became part of the fabric of French folklore. Ballads were sung about the lost children of Valois, telling of royal infants taken by shadows and heirs who walked into the forest never to return. Whether these songs were born of truth or imagination, they captured the unease of a nation that could not understand how a dynasty so powerful could be so fragile. The idea that the bloodline itself was cursed became a common belief, whispered in both villages and court corridors alike. For the surviving members of the family, the effect was devastating. Kings grew increasingly paranoid, surrounding themselves with spies and informants. Queens relied on confession and prophecy, seeking reassurance that their children would live to inherit the crown. Some even attempted to break the supposed curse through ritual or pilgrimage. Yet despite these efforts, the pattern continued, as though mocking every attempt to resist it. By the time of Charles's disappearance, the idea of normal succession had all but vanished. Advisors debated whether the throne should pass through collateral branches, fearing that the direct line was doomed. But every effort to secure stability seemed to invite further disaster. Each coronation was followed by another funeral, each alliance by another mysterious loss. The Valois reign became a study in contrasts, glorious achievements in art, architecture, and diplomacy overshadowed by private horrors that no king or queen could explain. Contemporary observers noted that while the dynasty's power extended across Europe, its personal misfortunes seemed endless. Ambassadors from other kingdoms often remarked on the strange quiet of the Valois court, where laughter was rare and conversation guarded. The palace itself seemed to absorb the melancholy of its occupants. Even celebrations carried an air of tension, as if joy itself might invite misfortune. The court's painters captured beautiful likenesses of the family, but always with an undercurrent of sadness in their eyes. Later historians would attempt to bring logic to the mystery. They pointed to the instability of medieval record-keeping, the unreliability of rumor, and the natural mortality of an age plagued by disease. They noted that the average lifespan, even among royalty, was short, and that political enemies often exaggerated tragedy to weaken the image of the crown. These rational explanations carry weight, yet they do not erase the sense of pattern that threads through every account. Too many names, too many vanishings, too much silence. What set the disappearances of Louis, Philippe, and Charles apart was not their rarity, but their repetition. Each event reinforced the fear that something larger than chance was at work. Each loss deepened the void at the heart of the dynasty. The royal line, once thought unshakable, became a story of absence, of heirs who never ruled, of legacies erased, of power that consumed its own promise. The early disappearances left marks that would never heal. They taught the Valois to distrust their own blood, to guard their children as if the crown itself were their enemy. They turned a royal family into a secretive institution, more concerned with survival than leadership. These first mysteries did more than unsettle a court, they changed the course of a dynasty. As the years unfolded, the same shadow that claimed Louis, Philippe, and Charles began to stretch further across France, reaching into every branch of the Valois family tree. What had once seemed isolated tragedies began to look like a deliberate pattern, a chain of loss that no one could break. And while the world outside the palace saw the rise and fall of kings, the wars of faith, and the struggles of empire, within the royal walls another battle raged quietly, one between legacy and oblivion. The disappearances of those first heirs marked the beginning of an era of doubt, and from that doubt grew fear, secrecy, and obsession. As more members of the Valois line vanished, the dynasty began to question not only who would inherit the throne, but whether the throne itself was worth inheriting. The stage was set for the next act of their tragic saga, where disappearance would no longer be seen as accident or fate, but as the defining curse of a house that had built its power upon the shifting ground of destiny itself. By the time the vanishings of Louis, Philippe, and Charles of Valois had faded into uneasy memory, the dynasty stood upon ground that no longer felt secure. The court had grown wary. Every noble's smile watched for hidden intent, every celebration clouded by the expectation of loss. What had once been the mere echo of tragedy had now hardened into a pattern, one so familiar that no birth announcement in the royal family was received without a shadow of fear. The Valois line, once radiant with youth and promise, had become haunted by the constant question of who would disappear next. It was in this tense and distrustful climate that the mystery took on new life, and the whispers of treason began to drown out the last remnants of innocence. The passing of years brought no relief. If anything, the sense of menace deepened. Heirs vanished more often, their fates obscured by intrigue and deception. Each loss followed the same rhythm: sudden illness, unexplained absence, contradictory reports, and official silence. To the common people, it was a curse. To the scholars and diplomats who observed from afar, it was a pattern of human ambition gone dark. But for those within the royal walls, it was something worse. It was survival. Henri of Valois grew up under the long shadow of those earlier disappearances. He had heard the story since childhood, though never from his parents directly. They spoke only of duty, of the sanctity of royal blood, and of the burden that came with inheritance. He was taught to be cautious even in friendship, to trust no servant completely, to eat only what was prepared by his own attendants. These lessons were meant to protect him, yet they only deepened his sense of dread. He understood from an early age that the palace was not merely a home, it was a theater of danger. When Henri reached manhood, he was admired for his charm and intellect. Courtiers praised his manner, while foreign envoys wrote of his poise and wit. Yet behind that composed exterior was a man who lived in constant vigilance. Every movement at court, every whispered conversation, every sudden silence at the table seemed charged with hidden meaning. He had reason to be cautious. One night, following a feast in honor of a visiting noble, Henri fell violently ill. His symptoms were swift and terrifying: convulsions, fever, and delirium. The royal physicians worked through the night, yet their remedies only seemed to worsen his condition. Within days, he was dead. The official explanation cited a sudden infection, but few believed it. His attendants were questioned, some imprisoned, and one later vanished from custody altogether. The people murmured that Henri had been poisoned. Though no proof was ever produced, the very speed of his decline and the secrecy surrounding his death convinced most that another Valois heir had been deliberately erased. The manner of Henri's death marked a turning point in the dynasty's long tragedy. It was no longer possible to dismiss these events as accidents or illnesses. The method had changed. Now the disappearances came clothed in ceremony, wrapped in plausible explanations, yet leaving the same hollow silence in their wake. The court no longer spoke openly of curses or divine punishment. Instead, suspicion turned inward, toward politics, rivalry, and betrayal. Not long after Henry's death came the loss of Francois Valois, whose charm and popularity made him both admired and envied. Francois was different from his predecessors, more daring, more visible, less willing to be bound by the cautious traditions of the family. He embraced the public, traveled often, and maintained friendships across political lines. To some, this openness was refreshing. To others, it was reckless. He had begun to attract the loyalty of powerful nobles, men whose allegiance could shift the balance of influence within the court. For those who sought control of the throne, Francois posed both a promise and a threat. He died after a hunting excursion. The official report claimed a fall from his horse, yet witnesses later described a scene that raised more questions than answers. His wounds were inconsistent with such an accident, and one rider, who survived the same hunt, swore that Francois had been struck by an arrow not meant for the deer. The statement vanished from official record, and the witness himself disappeared shortly afterward. Once again, silence closed around the truth. The twin losses of Henri and Francois sent ripples of fear through the court. The succession grew uncertain, and with it came opportunity for those ambitious enough to seize it. The Valois were surrounded by rivals, powerful dukes, foreign agents, and even members of their own extended family who had more to gain from instability than peace. Among the most whispered names was that of Marguerite of Valois, a woman whose intelligence and beauty made her both admired and feared. Known for her sharp mind and political instinct, Marguerite moved easily among factions. She was capable of charm when needed and cruelty when it served her ends. Her influence extended beyond her own household, reaching diplomats, soldiers, and even clergy. Some saw her as the glue that could hold the fragile dynasty together. Others saw her as a threat, an ambitious player in a game where too many pieces had already fallen. Rumors soon began to circle around her. Some accused her of plotting to position herself, or her favored relatives, as heirs to the throne. Others claimed she had knowledge of the poisonings that plagued the family. One particularly damning story suggested that she kept alchemists in secret chambers within her estates, men who could create deadly mixtures without trace. There is no surviving proof of such acts, but the whispers grew so persistent that even her allies began to distance themselves. In a court where rumor could destroy faster than any blade, her reputation became its own weapon. The Valois court, always a nest of intrigue, now transformed into something darker. Spies watched every noble, and letters were intercepted before they reached their intended hands. Alliances shifted daily, driven by fear of association. The poisonings, once rare, became almost expected. It was an age when the clink of a cup could make a man tremble, when every meal felt like a test of loyalty. Claude of Valois, another figure caught in this tangled web, was known for her quiet grace and her devotion to her family. Unlike Marguerite, Claude avoided open politics. She preferred solitude and study, often spending her hours in libraries or gardens rather than the crowded halls of the palace. But even she could not escape the dangers that had consumed her bloodline. Claude's death, though less public, deepened the mystery further. One morning, her attendants found her unconscious in her chambers. Physicians were summoned, and though they worked tirelessly, she never awoke. The diagnosis was vague, a sudden affliction of the heart. Yet whispers soon spread that the scent of bitter almonds had lingered in her room, a telltale sign known even then to those familiar with poisons. Her personal maid, the last to see her alive, disappeared within a week. The art of poisoning was not new to Europe, but within the Valois court it reached a level of refinement that bordered on obsession. Substances like arsenic, mercury, and belladonna could be disguised in perfumes, cosmetics, or even communion wine. Apothecaries and scholars alike experimented with mixtures that could kill swiftly or slowly, leaving little trace. Such knowledge was a kind of power, and in a world ruled by fear, power was a form of protection. Every noble household kept its own preferred apothecary, both as healer and as potential weapon. The Valois kings themselves employed official tasters, men whose task it was to test each dish and drink before it touched royal lips. Yet even this safeguard offered no certainty. There were accounts of entire kitchens replaced after a single suspicious illness. The mere rumor of poison could end a career, exile a servant, or spark a rebellion. Within this culture of mistrust, truth became fluid. A death could be called natural or accidental, depending on who held the pen that recorded it. The fear of poison soon bled into the larger politics of Europe. Foreign ambassadors began to send coded messages back to their courts, describing the French palace as a place where alliances were sealed not with ink but with venom. Diplomatic dinners became tense affairs, with every cup lifted in forced politeness. Even neighboring monarchs began to view the Valois as dangerous. People cursed not only by fate but by their own hand. Within France, the situation worsened. Each new disappearance created a vacuum that others sought to fill. The line between loyalty and ambition blurred beyond recognition. Some nobles aligned themselves with the church, others with foreign powers, and still others sought to play both sides. The Valois crown, once a symbol of unity, had become a prize for which many were willing to kill. Yet for all the suspicion cast upon outsiders, many believed the true enemy was within. The structure of the dynasty itself bred rivalry. Brothers competed for inheritance, mothers for influence, and distant cousins for recognition. The palace was not one family but many, each with its own secrets and ambitions. It was in this cauldron of self-interest that the disappearances flourished, not as acts of fate, but as calculated moves in a ruthless game. The chroniclers of the time began to record their doubts more openly. They spoke of meetings held in darkness, of letters written in code, of alliances bound by both faith and treachery. They described secret corridors within the palace, passages built in earlier generations for escape or discretion, now repurposed for schemes. Servants were bribed, guards were replaced, and messages were passed through the hands of trusted confessors. The king himself, increasingly isolated, became little more than a figurehead surrounded by fear. One particularly chilling account describes a banquet held to celebrate a peace treaty. The evening was lavish, silver goblets, music, laughter. Yet before dawn, 3 guests were dead, and another had fled the palace claiming he had seen a figure pour something into the royal wine. No investigation followed, for to speak of such things openly was to risk joining the list of the missing. It is easy, centuries later, to see the story of the Valois as a cautionary tale of excess and intrigue. Yet to those who lived it, it was survival. Every death was followed by careful adjustment. New heirs named, new alliances forged, new rumors crafted to distract the public. The dynasty's ability to endure despite the chaos is both remarkable and tragic. They managed to maintain appearances, to keep the machinery of power running even as it consumed its own heirs. What makes this period so haunting is that the boundary between political murder and superstition was never clearly drawn. Some truly believed the disappearances were the result of witchcraft or divine curse. Others used such beliefs as cover for their own crimes. The age was steeped in both faith and fear, and the two often worked together to obscure the truth. A poisoned chalice could be called God's punishment. A convenient death could be explained as destiny. As the losses mounted, even those untouched by direct tragedy began to feel the weight of the curse. Servants grew fearful of handling food. Courtiers avoided sharing meals. Religious relics multiplied across the palace. Saintly bones, fragments of the true cross, vials of holy water, all meant to protect the living from the unseen. The royal chapel became a place of desperation rather than devotion, filled with whispered prayers for safety rather than salvation. Marguerite, once so powerful and confident, eventually became consumed by the very rumors she had once manipulated. Her influence waned, and her allies abandoned her. She was accused, though never formally tried, of involvement in the death of François. Her estates were seized, her correspondence destroyed, and she lived her final years in guarded isolation. Some say she died peacefully. Others claim she was poisoned to ensure her silence. Claude's fate, though quieter, left a similar mark. Her death became the subject of secret inquiry within the church, though no results were ever released. One letter, preserved by a monk, describes her as the last innocent of her line, a woman whose purity made her both loved and dangerous to those who thrived on corruption. Her passing symbolized the loss not only of a life, but of the last trace of virtue in the royal. The Valois story during this time is one of decay masked by grandeur. The palaces still glittered, the processions still marched, the music still played, but beneath it all lay a suffocating fear. The court had become a labyrinth where every door led to danger, and every friendship could turn fatal. The dynasty was trapped in a cycle of deceit, each generation repeating the sins of the last, each heir stepping unknowingly toward the same fate. By the time the century drew toward its close, the pattern of disappearances had become almost expected. To be born of Valois blood was to live under a sentence without a name. The people, weary of rumor and scandal, began to see the monarchy not as divine but as cursed, a living symbol of how power devours itself. The faith that once bound ruler and subject was replaced by suspicion, and with it, the foundation of the dynasty began to crumble. The shadow that began with Jean-Marie Louis and Philippe had now grown into something immense, a storm of ambition, poison, and betrayal that no prayer could dispel. Each new heir who entered the world carried not only the hopes of a kingdom, but also the certainty of peril. Henry's mysterious illness, François' fatal hunt, Marguerite's downfall, and Claude's silent death all fit into a single grim design. Whether born of human cruelty or some darker curse, the result was the same. The Valois had turned inward, devouring their own future. In their pursuit of power, they had woven a web so intricate that even they could no longer tell who held the threads. And as the dynasty crept toward its inevitable end, the once golden crown of France gleamed not as a symbol of glory, but as a relic of sorrow, heavy with the memory of those heirs who vanished, one after another, into silence. The Valois dynasty had by now become a house of whispers. Its halls echoed less with music and laughter than with the cautious murmur of suspicion. The once proud family, builders of cathedrals and patrons of beauty, had been reduced to a legend of fear. The pattern of loss, begun with the early heirs and deepened through the deaths of Henri, François, and Claude, did not stop. It only changed shape. The vanishings became subtler, woven more carefully into the political events of the age. They no longer came as isolated tragedies, but as parts of a deliberate rhythm that followed the dynasty's fortunes. And at the heart of this shadowed tale stood two figures whose disappearances came to define its darkest chapter: Catherine of Valois and René of Valois. Catherine was born into a world already burdened by the past. The court into which she arrived was heavy with paranoia and unspoken dread. Every meal was tested, every chamber guarded, and every prayer for safety uttered with the knowledge that divine protection had failed too many times before. Yet Catherine, from the beginning, seemed untouched by fear. Chroniclers describe her as bright, poised, and unusually intelligent. She possessed the kind of self-assurance that could command attention without words, and perhaps for that reason alone, she quickly became a figure of fascination within the court. Her marriage prospects drew interest across Europe. Diplomats from England, Burgundy, and Italy all sought to tie their fortunes to hers. Yet behind every proposal lurked the shadow of politics. The union of a Valois princess was never about affection, it was about power. The men who surrounded her saw her not as a person but as a bridge, one that could secure alliances or topple them. In her teenage years, she was sent to live under the watch of her mother's advisors, away from the main court, a move that was officially explained as preparation for marriage, but which many saw as an act of protection. Still, that protection did not last. Catherine's disappearance came at a time when the kingdom stood on the brink of conflict. Rival factions within the French court had begun to turn openly hostile. One group favored a stronger alliance with England. Another looked to cement ties with the Italian states. Catherine's potential betrothal was at the center of this dispute. Letters from foreign envoys suggest that her marriage would have decided the balance of power, possibly even ending a costly war. Then, without warning, she was gone. The official record says that Catherine fell ill during a journey to a convent and died there in seclusion. Yet no burial was ever recorded. No tomb ever marked her passing. Her attendants were dismissed without explanation, and her personal belongings vanished from inventory. The chronicler who first wrote of her death noted, almost in passing, that the king's secretary ordered all correspondence related to her marriage negotiations destroyed. For historians, that single detail stands as one of the most striking pieces of evidence that Catherine's disappearance was no accident. If Catherine's fate was veiled in silence, René of Valois was shrouded in contradiction. She was younger, more impulsive, and far less guarded. Where Catherine embodied restraint, René represented defiance. She spoke freely, questioned decisions, and formed friendships with people outside the court's approval. It was said that she often mocked the rituals of royal life, finding them hollow and absurd. Her popularity with the common people, who admired her unpretentious manner, became a quiet source of irritation among the nobility. René's disappearance occurred under even stranger circumstances. She was last seen attending a festival near the royal estate, surrounded by guards and courtiers. The next morning, her attendants found her bed empty, her horse missing, and her chamber window open. At first, it was assumed she had fled in an act of rebellion. Search parties were dispatched, but no trace was ever found. Within weeks, the official story shifted. It was said that she had fallen from her horse during a late-night ride and drowned in a nearby lake. Yet the lake was thoroughly searched, and nothing was recovered. The strange consistency of these stories, illnesses with no witnesses, accidents without bodies, funerals without graves, created a timeline of deceit that stretched across generations. In Catherine's and René's cases, however, historians have found connections that hint at deliberate design. Both disappearances occurred during moments when the Valois dynasty stood at political crossroads. Catherine's proposed marriage threatened to unite France with England under terms unfavorable to certain factions at court. René's growing influence among the common people posed an internal danger to the authority of the crown. In both cases, their removal conveniently preserved the power of the existing hierarchy. The name most often tied to these vanishings in later accounts is that of Louise of Valois, another royal of the bloodline whose ambitions were said to run deep. Unlike Catherine and René, Louise survived, but her shadow falls over their stories. She was known for her shrewdness, her patience, and her talent for manipulation. Some saw her as a stabilizing force, others as the hidden architect of much of the dynasty's intrigue. Letters attributed to foreign diplomats describe her as the quiet flame at the heart of every storm. She stood to gain from both Catherine's and René's disappearances, for their absence elevated her influence and brought her closer to the royal center. There are records of Louise meeting privately with advisors in the days before Catherine's final journey. One chronicler claims she urged the king to delay Catherine's marriage, warning that it could unravel the peace of the realm. Another report places her near the royal council during the week of René's disappearance, offering counsel on how to manage the public reaction. Whether these connections mark her as an opportunist or as a participant in a darker plan remains a matter of speculation. But in the shifting loyalties of that court, ambition was as lethal as poison. And poison, as it happens, continued to play its role. The age was steeped in chemical experimentation. Alchemists, physicians, and herbalists moved between the worlds of science and sorcery, creating potions that could heal or kill depending on intent. Many of these figures found employment in the Valois court, where the line between medicine and murder was often indistinguishable. Records show that in the years surrounding the disappearances of Catherine and René, new poisons appeared in Europe, substances that killed slowly, leaving symptoms that could mimic natural illness. One theory, supported by letters discovered in the archives of Burgundy, suggests that Catherine was not killed outright, but drugged and removed to prevent her marriage. The plan, according to this account, was to keep her hidden until the political crisis passed. If so, she may have lived for years under a false name, perhaps even in another country. No proof exists, yet the idea has persisted in both historical debate and folklore. As for René, another document, written by a physician later imprisoned for heresy, claims that a noblewoman of Valois blood was poisoned with a distilled extract derived from belladonna, a substance capable of inducing paralysis and death without visible trace. The timing of this account aligns almost exactly with the year of René's disappearance. If these accounts hold any truth, they reveal a dynasty that had turned its own blood into collateral. The Valois rulers, desperate to preserve power, may have resorted to eliminating anyone whose presence threatened the delicate balance of authority. The heirs who vanished were not simply victims of misfortune. They were sacrifices made to maintain a kingdom on the edge of collapse. This theory, while grim, fits too neatly with the historical context to be ignored. France during this period was riven by wars of succession, religious conflict, and financial ruin. Each new reign began with promise and ended in crisis. The monarchy's survival depended on perception, on the appearance of stability even when chaos reigned beneath the surface. In such a world, the death or disappearance of a single heir could change everything. Removing inconvenient claimants was not only plausible, but perhaps necessary in the minds of those who believed they were protecting the realm. Catherine's and René's vanishings coincided with critical moments of negotiation between the French and English crowns. Their marriages could have united or divided the two kingdoms. Their deaths removed uncertainty, allowing the existing leadership to act without opposition. Similarly, Louise's growing influence ensured that the remaining heirs were shaped in her image, their alliances carefully chosen to strengthen her position. What appeared from the outside as misfortune may, from within, have been deliberate consolidation of control. Yet not all scholars accept this as the full truth. Some argue that these disappearances were the result not of design, but of the dynasty's own instability. The Valois, they say, were victims of their own reputation. Every natural death became suspect, every absence magnified by paranoia. The more the court tried to conceal tragedy, the more monstrous it appeared. In that light, Catherine and René may have simply died as many did in that age, young and unexpectedly, while their memory was distorted by the court's need for secrecy. But even if their ends were natural, the choice to hide them was not. The decision to erase their presence from public record was a political act, one that reveals a monarchy consumed by fear of weakness. The Valois did not merely lose their heirs, they destroyed the memory of them. In doing so, they transformed private grief into public mystery, feeding the legend that would outlive them. Louise's later years only deepened the intrigue. After the deaths of her cousins, her authority within the court reached its height. She presided over key councils, influenced marriages, and negotiated treaties. Yet her success carried a heavy cost. Her name became synonymous with the decay of the dynasty itself. Some accused her of witchcraft, others of treason. As rebellion and religious strife tore through France, her power waned, and she withdrew from public life. She died quietly, her legacy divided between admiration and fear. The disappearance of Catherine and René marked the final stage of the dynasty's moral collapse. After them, the Valois line could no longer claim innocence or divine favor. Their losses had become too numerous, their silences too deliberate. The blood that once symbolized the unity of France had turned into a chain of ghosts. Each generation inherited not strength but guilt, and that guilt weighed heavily on those who followed. When Charles, the last true Valois king, ascended the throne, he carried with him the burden of every vanished name. He was surrounded by counselors who remembered the past too well and by rivals who waited for the pattern to repeat. The line that had begun with such promise centuries before now stood at the edge of extinction. The mysterious fates of Catherine, René, and the others had stripped the dynasty of its future. The broader impact of these disappearances on French history cannot be overstated. They weakened the monarchy's legitimacy, eroded public trust, and opened the path for the rise of rival houses. The Bourbons, who would eventually inherit the crown, did so not merely through fortune, but through the vacuum left by Valois failure. Each disappearance had chipped away at the dynasty's foundation until nothing solid remained. By the time the last Valois king fell, the people no longer saw their monarchs as chosen by God, but as cursed by their own sins. Catherine's vanishing robbed France of a potential queen who might have united two kingdoms. René's disappearance silenced a voice that could have bridged the gap between the nobility and the people. Louise's survival ensured that the dynasty's politics remained ruthless, but it also hastened its moral ruin. Together, their fates illustrate how the pursuit of control destroyed the very thing it sought to preserve. Even after the line ended, the legend of the missing heirs persisted. In villages and cities, tales were told of hidden Valois descendants living in secret, waiting to reclaim their birthright. Some believed that Catherine had escaped to a convent and left behind a child who carried her blood. Others said René had fled across the sea and lived among commoners, her identity forgotten. These stories, though never proven, reveal the longing of a people who refused to accept that so much royal promise could vanish without trace. The truth, however, is less romantic and far more haunting. The Valois dynasty fell not because of external enemies, but because of the rot within its own heart. Every act of concealment, every disappearance, every whispered lie became a stone in the tomb they built for themselves. Their history, once glorious, turned into a warning, a testament to what happens when the fear of losing power becomes greater than the desire to lead. When historians look back on the Valois era, they see a kingdom at war not only with its neighbors, but with its own conscience. The disappearances of Catherine, René, and Louise's influence form the final arc of that struggle. Whether they were victims of deliberate purge or of the cruel logic of monarchy, their absence reshaped the destiny of France. The succession that might have followed Charles VIII never came to pass, as it should have. The line fractured, and with it, the dream of a unified dynasty died. The Valois had built their empire through ambition, but they sustained it through fear. In the end, that fear consumed them. The heirs who vanished left behind not heirs of their own, but stories that blurred the line between truth and legend. The royal chronicle that began with triumph closed in silence, a silence filled with the echoes of those who were erased. And though centuries have passed, that silence still lingers, a reminder that behind the grandeur of crowns and thrones lies the same human frailty that can undo even the mightiest of dynasties. The story of the Valois dynasty does not end with the silence of their vanished heirs. It lingers, breathing through archives, letters, and fragments of rumor that refuse to fade. Centuries have passed since the last of their line vanished from the throne, yet the mystery remains. Every disappearance, every erased name, continues to whisper across time, calling historians, writers, and ordinary people alike to wonder what truly happened to those who should have carried the Valois legacy forward. From the lost children of Louis XI to the unrecorded fates of later heirs, the pattern of vanishing still echoes, shaping how we remember the past and how we interpret the fragility of power. The children of Louis XI mark one of the earliest turning points in this continuing enigma. Their existence should have ensured a smooth succession, a secure transition of royal authority. Yet their lives were touched by the same shadow that had haunted the house for generations. Chroniclers recorded illnesses that came without warning, travels that ended abruptly, and strange absences in court ceremonies where heirs were expected to stand. Some of these children vanished from the record before reaching maturity, their names appearing once in royal registers and then never again. The kingdom that had celebrated their births moved on as if they had never lived. For historians, the loss of these young heirs raises troubling questions. How could so many members of one royal family simply disappear without trace? Were these omissions a failure of record-keeping or deliberate acts of concealment? The truth, as always with the Valois, lies somewhere between tragedy and design. The monarchy, desperate to project stability, had long learned that silence was a political tool. When an heir fell ill or died under suspicious circumstances, it was often easier to erase the event than to explain it. Such omissions created the illusion of order, even as the dynasty fractured from within. By the time the reign of François II arrived, the pattern had become a familiar wound in the fabric of French history. He was young, frail, and surrounded by factions that sought to use him as a pawn in their pursuit of influence. Yet what draws attention now are not only his brief reign and early death, but the stories of his lost siblings, who never took their place in the royal narrative. Their names are faint traces in correspondence, brief mentions in diplomatic records, and passing notes in church accounts. Some were said to have been sent away for education or safety. Others were whispered to have died in infancy. Still, the lack of burial records and the inconsistencies between sources suggest something more deliberate. Those who study the Valois mystery often point to these missing children as the final pieces in a centuries-long puzzle. Their disappearances occurred during a time when France was again on the edge of religious war and political division. Every heir carried not only royal blood, but also the potential to tip the balance of power. In such an environment, even the existence of a child could threaten the plans of ambitious nobles or rival factions within the court. Removing or concealing heirs may have seemed, to some, a necessary act of preservation. The legend that grew around these vanished heirs became inseparable from the identity of the dynasty itself. In later centuries, chroniclers began to weave tales of secret survival, stories that suggested some of these children escaped, hidden by loyal servants or sympathetic nobles, living out their days under false names in distant provinces. Folklore tells of a quiet monastery that once sheltered a youth said to bear a striking resemblance to François II. Another story speaks of a girl raised in secrecy who claimed descent from a Valois line long thought extinct. Whether any of these tales hold truth is uncertain, but their persistence reveals how deeply the mystery had taken root in the collective imagination. Modern historians face a challenge when confronting these accounts. The records of the period are incomplete, often contradictory, and sometimes intentionally falsified. Letters were burned, registers altered, and entire years of correspondence are missing. Yet even with the gaps, patterns emerge, patterns that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. The same officials who handled the affairs of the vanished heirs later appeared in roles connected to other mysterious deaths within the royal court. The same advisors who urged silence in one case advocated secrecy in another. To many scholars, this points toward a long-standing system of control within the monarchy, designed to manage not just succession but memory itself. Conspiracy theorists, however, have taken the mystery far beyond the boundaries of documented history. They argue that the disappearances were part of a hidden war within the royal family, a conflict that spanned generations. Some claim that a clandestine group within the Valois household orchestrated these events to preserve an unbroken line of influence that continued long after the dynasty's official fall. Others suggest connections to secret religious orders, early forms of espionage, or even ancient prophecies that foretold the fall of the Valois line. While such theories lack verifiable evidence, they illustrate the powerful grip the story holds over the human imagination. For many, the enduring fascination lies not in the details of each case, but in what the disappearances represent. The Valois heirs symbolize the tension between appearance and reality, between the grandeur of monarchy and the fragility that lies beneath it. Each lost successor reflects a moment when power consumed its own blood to survive. Whether through disease, murder, or deliberate erasure, the end result was always the same: silence, confusion, and a kingdom left to wonder what truths had been buried with its children. Some scholars have tried to reconstruct the final years of the dynasty by piecing together fragments from church archives, private letters, and foreign diplomatic correspondence. In these sources, one finds faint echoes of the lost heirs, references to the child kept from the court, or the prince who could not be presented. These phrases, while vague, suggest a pattern of concealment that aligns with the dynasty's long history of secrecy. There are even reports from English and Italian observers who claimed that certain members of the French royal family were hidden away for their own safety. Yet such explanations raise more questions than they answer. What danger required royal children to be hidden? And if safety was truly the motive, why were their names erased so completely from the official record? A growing number of historians view the Valois mystery as a reflection of the monarchy's own struggle to define legitimacy. In an age when divine right was the foundation of royal authority, any hint of weakness could undermine the entire system. The disappearance of heirs, therefore, had to be managed carefully, concealed from the public eye, and wrapped in layers of ritual and rumor. By controlling the narrative, the monarchy could maintain the illusion of continuity even when bloodlines faltered. This obsession with appearance ultimately became the dynasty's undoing. In trying to preserve power through secrecy, the Valois lost the very trust that power required. There is also a moral dimension to this story that continues to resonate. The vanished heirs of the Valois remind us that power often demands silence from those it harms. The children who disappeared were not merely political figures, but human beings caught in the machinery of ambition. Their erasure speaks to a truth that transcends history. When power is absolute, innocence becomes expendable. That is perhaps why their stories continue to haunt the imagination. They are not simply relics of a lost age, but mirrors held up to every system that sacrifices truth for control. In recent decades, renewed interest in the Valois mystery has led to new investigations. Historians using modern technology, such as forensic analysis of burial sites and DNA testing, have sought to uncover physical evidence of the lost heirs. Some skeletal remains discovered near former royal estates were at first believed to belong to members of the Valois line, though results have been inconclusive. Other researchers have turned to digital archives, reconstructing genealogies and correspondence networks in the hope of finding overlooked connections. While these efforts have yet to solve the mystery, they have deepened understanding of how thoroughly the dynasty controlled information. What emerges from all this research is a portrait of a family trapped by its own legend. The Valois lived under the weight of expectations so immense that failure could not be admitted, even to themselves. Their court was a world of ritual and surveillance, where every gesture carried political meaning. In such an environment, truth became dangerous, and the line between protection and conspiracy blurred beyond recognition. The vanishings were not isolated crimes, but symptoms of a deeper sickness, a system in which image mattered more than life itself. The question that remains is whether the Valois were unique or merely an early example of a recurring pattern in history. Across centuries and continents, powerful families have faced similar mysteries: missing heirs, hidden births, and rewritten records. The Valois story, then, may be less an anomaly than a reflection of the universal instability of dynastic power. It shows how easily the pursuit of permanence can lead to self-destruction, and how every secret meant to preserve authority eventually erodes it. Even today, scholars debate whether the mystery can ever truly be solved. The evidence is too fragmented, the motives too deeply buried beneath layers of political necessity. Yet perhaps the value of the story lies not in reaching a final answer, but in confronting the questions it raises. What does it mean to inherit a legacy built on silence? How do we separate fact from the fictions that history itself creates? And how much of the past do we truly want to uncover when each revelation may alter our understanding of power, loyalty, and justice? These questions continue to draw people to the Valois story. In lecture halls, podcasts, documentaries, and late-night discussions among amateur historians, the topic resurfaces again and again. The names of the lost heirs, Louis, Philippe, Henri, Francois, Catherine, René, Louise, still carry a strange power, as if time itself has refused to let them fade. Each retelling adds a new layer of interpretation, blending history and imagination in the same way the Valois once blended truth and deception. The mystery's endurance also reveals something about human nature. We are drawn to the unknown, especially when it lies close to the symbols of greatness. A vanished heir is more than a missing person. It is the embodiment of possibility denied. It represents what might have been, a future lost to secrecy and fear. The Valois dynasty, in its triumphs and tragedies, provides the perfect stage for this fascination. Their story is a reminder that beneath the glitter of royal courts lies the same vulnerability that defines all human endeavors. The legacy of the Valois vanished heirs therefore reaches beyond history into the realm of reflection. They stand as silent witnesses to the fragility of power, the danger of secrecy, and the limits of control. Their fate urges us to question how much of our own history is shaped by what has been hidden, and how many truths remain buried beneath the polished surface of recorded events. The same forces that once erased their names still exist in different forms today. Governments, institutions, and individuals who decide which stories are told and which are forgotten. As the centuries pass, the Valois mystery becomes less about solving a case and more about understanding the cost of silence. It teaches that every attempt to control history leaves traces that future generations will uncover. The missing heirs remind us that time itself is the greatest detective, uncovering secrets that even the most powerful could not bury forever. So, as we look back on the Valois line, from the lost children of Louis XI to the unrecorded fates of Francois II's siblings, we find not closure but resonance. Their stories call to us because they are unfinished, their endings unwritten. They invite each generation to imagine, to question, and to remember. In that sense, the Valois heirs have achieved a kind of immortality. Their lives, though cut short or erased, continue to shape the way we think about history, power, and truth. Perhaps that is the final irony of their fate. In trying to erase them, the dynasty ensured they would never be forgotten. The mystery became their monument, more enduring than any crown or palace. And so their echo continues, through books, through speculation, through the quiet curiosity of those who refuse to accept silence as an answer. Now their story belongs to us, to everyone who listens, reads, and wonders. The question remains open, waiting for each of us to decide what we believe. Were the vanished heirs victims of a system consumed by fear? Were they hidden survivors who slipped through the cracks of history? Or were they symbols of something deeper, the inevitable collapse of any power built on secrecy? Whatever conclusion one reaches, the Valois mystery stands as a lasting reflection of the human condition. Power fades, truth bends, and memory persists. And so, as this tale closes, it leaves behind a single thought to carry forward. History is never as certain as it seems, and every silence holds a story waiting to be found. If you followed this journey through the shadows of the Valois line, consider what their story reveals about the world we live in now. What other truths might still be buried beneath the surface of our own histories? What heirs, what legacies, have been lost to time because someone chose to hide them? Share your thoughts, your theories, and your interpretations. The mystery lives on not only in archives and ruins, but in the minds of those who continue to ask questions. And if this story has sparked curiosity, there are countless others waiting to be uncovered. Tales of forgotten dynasties, lost thrones, and secrets that shaped the course of nations. The past is full of echoes, and every echo leads to a deeper truth. So stay curious, keep questioning, and listen for the voices history tried to silence. The story of the Valois may have ended long ago, but its echoes through time remind us that no secret remains buried forever.